Great. Well, welcome everyone to April edition of Finding Common Ground. I'm Nick Troiano.
I'm Charlie Wheelan. Good to see you, Nick. I mean, I'm kind of meeting you too. We're across the country.
Yes, so I'm here in Denver, Colorado, Unite America headquarters, and Charlie's there at Dartmouth in New Hampshire. And we're coming to you today with a new edition talking about the national debt and specifically entitlement reform, how both parties can find common ground on this issue. But first, as always, we'd love to start off with a little update on where we're at as a movement. So over the last month, I'm sure you saw the news, Charlie, we have a couple of new candidates that were endorsed by our partner, Washington Independents. They're trying to recruit and support state legislative candidates in Washington state. So Ned Whitting and Marco Padilla are the two latest candidates running for state house there. And we've done some polling in Washington. We're going to release it next week, so stay tuned on what voter perceptions are of independents. But one really interesting thing about Washington, it's one of two states with a top two primary. And so if independents get through that primary, it's head-to-head in the general election, which totally eliminates the whole spoiler argument so often used against independents.
I do think it's important to think about how these process reforms complement what we're doing. And sometimes the process reforms seem pretty wonky, but they really have the potential to radically change the electoral environment.
We're following all of our statewide candidates very closely. We've, as you know, endorsed 5 of them running for U.S. Senate and governor. First quarter reports are in for fundraising, and want to give a shout out to Neil Simon in Maryland who actually outraised the incumbent, Ben Cardin, which is a big deal because that race is shaping up to be a strong head-to-head matchup, not between the Republican and the Democrat, but between the independent and the Democrat.
Yeah, and that's how upsets happen when somebody's been around a long, long time, kind of goes to sleep on the watch, and then they get caught out. Particularly when you've got somebody as exciting as Neil Simon, who's really a very attractive and dynamic candidate.
We also saw the entrance of a new independent U.S. Senate candidate in Indiana. His name is Nathan Altman, and he's a young entrepreneur, happens to be the youngest U.S. Senate candidate in the country at 30 years old, which I think matters. It's relevant to the issue we're discussing today, which is a lot of the issues confronting the country are going to impact future generations and younger people a lot more. So it's good to see him in the race.
I think Indiana's an interesting state too. I mean, Indiana's the place that produced Evan Bayh, that produced Mitch Daniels, right? So very pragmatic, well-respected Republican who, could have been a great presidential candidate if he'd had the fire in his belly. So those kinds of states, I think, are interesting to watch.
And one more thing to point out, which is that as filing deadlines pass for Democrats and Republicans, independents still have a lot more time to get on the ballot. So just yesterday, I was looking up on Ballotpedia that there are 56 congressional seats that are currently uncontested by a major party. And many of the deadlines have passed. So if you're interested in running as an independent, head over to uniteamerica.org, fill out the form, we'll be in touch. But
there is a lot of activity on the House side. It's not obviously where our strategic focus is right now. But just anecdotally, I'm hearing from an increasing number of people who are looking at these kinds of seats, looking at the changing electoral landscape, the backlash against the Republican Party, kind of the dearth of good Democratic challengers. And I'm not surprised to see that there's this activity. And hopefully down the road, we can be more of a presence in those kinds of races.
Especially as we grow this movement. So for those tuning in, you can help us spread the word right now by clicking like and share on this live stream so we can reach even more people with this message of common sense and independence in our politics. You can also catch on our blog all the past editions of Finding Common Ground at uniteamerica.org, and you can sign up to become a founding member of the movement at uniteamerica.org/membership, which we encourage everyone to do. So Charlie, this month's topic of debt and entitlements, why the focus on this issue now?
Because the debt is exploding. It's always been a problem. It was one of the things you did early in your career. We'll talk about that. The recent tax cut combined with the explosion of entitlements, which we knew was coming, but you've got the baby boomers retiring at the same time that the lid has come off healthcare costs, all of these things combined. And then there's the kicker, which we can talk about, which is as the debt grows, it's all borrowed money. So interest rates or the interest on the debt climbs too, which then compounds the debt. It's just when you look at the numbers, there have been new forecasts from CBO and other organizations, Congressional Budget Office, after that tax cut. The numbers, which have always been scary, got scarier.
Yes. And one thing that was interesting is the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, one of the premier think tanks out there with nonpartisan analysis on this issue, showed a graph of next year's budget deficit approaching $1 trillion, but more than half of it was as a result of this Congress that's in office right now. So not only the tax cut, but also the budget agreement, which spent a lot more money both on discretionary programs and on defense.
Right. And I think the other reason it's on the agenda now is that basic economic theory says you should not be running huge deficits when the economy is running near full speed. So back when we were in the financial crisis, the numbers looked terrible, but that was because tax revenues were down. There was spending on the stimulus, all of which is broadly supported by macroeconomists because you kind of want to spend to give a little stimulus to the economy. And then when you come out of it, you're supposed to pay down the debt that you accumulated during bad times. So when it gets to good times, you think about this in the lifestyle model. If you get into your 50s, your peak earning years, and you're still borrowing, there's a problem. So I think economists are concerned now seeing the size of the deficits when the economy really doesn't have much room to get a whole lot better.
Yep. So we'll be taking your questions. If you have a question or thought, please type it below and we will get to it. So obviously we know that there's no one lever to fixing this debt and deficit problem. There are several. We have to deal with spending, we have to deal with revenue, and then of course growth. And on the spending side, most of the growth in spending, it seems, going forward. That's good background music.
Mission Impossible. This is what we do, Nick.
Right, exactly. Most of the growth in spending is going to be as a result of an aging population and growing healthcare costs. So we're mainly talking about Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, collectively sometimes referred to as entitlements. Can you, Charlie, put that in context to why focusing on entitlements is a critical piece to fixing this debt problem?
Right. There are a whole bunch of reasons to focus on it. One, entitlements have a legal definition, which is that if Congress does nothing, the checks continue to go out. It is a legal obligation on the part of the government to pay them, and it's called entitlement because if you turn 65 or 67 and a half in the case of Social Security and you are eligible, then you get the check. That's it. Congress doesn't have to pass it. It can't be rescinded by a simple act of Congress. These are programs that are in place. Now, what that means is that if Congress does nothing, it does a lot, which is to say these programs continue on their current trajectory. So it's important to understand that if you say, well, I want to do nothing Congress because then they won't spend my money, that's simply wrong. They are spending your money by doing nothing. The other thing is, I think it's very important to correct this misperception that we have a spending problem because Congress is using earmarks and building unnecessary dams in certain places and waste, fraud, and abuse. All that's just complete nonsense. The spending is going to places that you identify, which are programs that most Americans are going to receive. Social Security and Medicare are middle-class programs. Most of the spending is not going to poor people on welfare programs. Medicaid is dedicated towards people who are low income. That's a healthcare problem. But the bulk of it is going to, my parents, your grandparents, those kinds of folks. And the trajectory, because of a number of things. One is rising healthcare costs, rising much faster than the economy and inflation. The other is an aging population. People are living longer. Therefore, they are eligible to receive these benefits until death, and death is now much later than it was in the past. Just as a little factoid, when Social Security was created, the average life expectancy was around 65, and you became eligible at age 65. So now we've moved the retirement age up a little bit, but life expectancy is up in the 80s. So we just haven't corrected that anomaly. So you've got not just an aging population, but you also have the baby boomers, which is this huge cohort of folks born after World War II who are moving through the life cycle. If you want to know where the baby boomers are, both George W. Bush and Bill Clinton are boomers. They're kind of the cutting edge. Bill Clinton's already had heart surgery. So that group moves into retirement as a huge cohort. They used to be paying into the system. Now they're taking benefits out of the system. And it's a big group that will live long and be very expensive.
As you were saying before, this is also called mandatory spending, right? Congress doesn't have appropriations authority over it, year in, year out. 10 years ago, mandatory spending was 62%. Today, it's 70%. A decade from now, it's going to be 77%. So unless we have some structural reforms, they're just nipping at the ends of the problem, when Congress is in session, which makes the problem that much harder to solve. The Committee for Responsible Federal Budget I mentioned before has a great tool online called the Social Security Reformer, where you can tweak some of the variables of the program. It's essentially a giant math problem. So what are the fixes, Charlie, that you think could get at trying to make Social Security in particular solvent?
Well, I think the first thing is conceptually, you just have to appreciate that you can't cut your way out of the problem only, which is to say there's nothing you can do that's consistent with broad political preferences that is going to solve the problem without raising some revenue. And similarly, you cannot tax your way out of the problem if you keep the benefit structure the same. It's going to have to be some combination of revenue increases and benefit cuts. Benefit cuts include things like raising the retirement age, where you may get the same check, it's just going to be for a shorter period of time and so on. That's where the debate is going to happen, and this is called common ground, because one of the things we have to do as independents is just get people into the room to make those hard choices. There's some things that are relatively easy from an economic standpoint, not necessarily from a political standpoint. On the revenue side, you always want to start with taxing things and behaviors you don't like. So, the example I give is if you tax income, people work less. If you tax carbon or gas, people pollute less. Which one of those is a better way to raise revenue? Many of the commissions that have looked at this have therefore proposed things like an increase in the gas tax, which has essentially been frozen since a long time ago. So those revenues are flat at a time when our transportation needs are rising. On the spending side, as I said earlier, Social Security was created at a time when people weren't living as long. It is a security program for old age. 65, is no longer that old. So one thing you can do is to kind of modify that so it takes account of the fact that people are living longer. You might do something for the fact that people who have done very hard professions, physical labor, might not physically be able to work longer, but lots of us will be able to. So taking the retirement age to 69 and a half, 70 would probably not create a hardship for a lot of people and would have a huge impact on the program. You can means test the benefits, which is to say if you get to age 68 and you've done really well in life, we're not going to take your check away, but it might be smaller than it otherwise would be. You can change the way we calculate inflation. These are kind of small fixes, but add up to huge amounts. So it's kind of like a seesaw. There's money coming in, and that's going to have to go up, and there's money going out. And at the end of the day, you just got to balance those over the long run.
Right. When I was playing with that tool before, two changes in particular. If you raise the retirement age to 69, it solves 39% of the shortfall. If you increase the taxable wages going into Social Security from about 84%, where it is today, 90%, that closes 31%. So there you go, 70% of the problem is solved by those two fixes alone, which both seem pretty reasonable on their face.
Right, and we should point out, when you say something like raise the retirement age to 69, that's not for people who are currently 68. That's for people who are currently like 29. I mean, it's phased in over a long period of time. Nobody over about age 55 would be affected at all, depending on how you chose to do it. Yeah, so those kinds of things are very politically difficult. Social Security, we have to say, though, is the easier of the two. If you look at healthcare costs or Social Security, the attractive thing about Social Security is there's a formula, and we've promised you a certain amount at retirement age until death. That check has a number on it, $2,021.85. We know who's going to move into retirement. We know how much we owe them, and we can play around with the numbers to great effect. Healthcare is different. Healthcare in the form of Medicare and Medicaid is essentially a blank check. What we have promised you is not a certain amount of money. We have promised you good health until death, whatever that may cost. Now, if you're reading the same newspaper as I am, there was actually an article today about $1 million cancer cures, and the subheadline was, who's going to pay for this? So the great news is we've got more medical options than ever before. The problem is they cost more, and somebody's going to have to pay for that. So, my personal preference would be to put some cap, maybe 2% or a percentage and a half above GDP growth on the rate of growth in Medicare, And then that would force us to make some hard decisions. But I think without that constraint, we're not going to have the backbone to make difficult decisions about end-of-life care and other things that are not easy.
Right. One last point on Social Security before we move on. I want to talk to you more about Medicare, which is that the trust fund that the latest report showed is going to run empty in 2031. So if we do nothing, as I said before, that's when the trust fund goes empty, and benefits can only be covered by whatever revenue is brought in a particular year, which means and guarantees a 29% across the board benefit cut for everyone. And so sometimes when people say hands off Social Security, don't touch it,
Right.
what they're really saying is just wait until 2031 and everyone's going to get a 29% benefit cut.
Right. And this is the kind of, leaving it on autopilot is headed towards a cliff. So doing nothing is really a very activist approach, and it's not an attractive one.
So on Medicare, where are the levers there? Do you think to slow down? You were talking about putting it
right. The big lever is a process change. If you look at the data, the United States spends as much as twice as much as many other developed countries on healthcare as a proportion of GDP, also in absolute terms, and we get worse outcomes. Life expectancy trails many European countries, it trails Japan. You can't blame all of that on the healthcare system because we're also quite violent. Our infant mortality rate is quite high, so when people die at birth, it really pulls down the life expectancy. But you can safely say that we're not getting a great deal. If anybody had such a poor value in any other realm of life, they would complain. So the place to begin is, can we spend less and get more? And that, in most places in life, that's not something that you can usually do. They're hard trade-offs. Because we have a fee-for-service system in healthcare in the United States, you pay your doctor or the healthcare system every time they do something, every time they take a test, every time they do an operation. Until recently, if they amputated the wrong digit, they could still charge you when they went back and amputated the right one. If you got an infection in the hospital, they could then charge you for fixing the infection, which is totally crazy. If you imagine you've got a contractor in your house who you've hired to, replace your oven, and he or she breaks the window on the way in and says, don't worry, I'll replace that for $150. You're like, no, you replace it free. What we need to do is move to a system where there's a fixed payment related to quality outcomes, where if you have diabetes, we pay you a certain amount and you do a range of things that treat diabetes, as opposed to paying for every blood test, every treatment, every pharmaceutical product, because that's just a recipe for overcharging and for too many procedures.
So to me, reimbursing doctors and providers based on quality of care, that doesn't seem like a partisan issue. That seems pretty...
Nothing that we have discussed other than maybe the mix of spending and tax revenue increases and spending cuts. Conceptually, none of this is partisan. I mean, this is all just different flavors of a choice set. On the healthcare one, you're absolutely right. This is even less partisan than everything else. There's really nobody who wants to spend more and get less. Here we have in front of us perhaps the sweet spot of American politics, where we really can take cost out and make people healthier. Perfect example would be prevention. The example I use with my students is, if you've got a grandmother who's 85 and she falls in her home and breaks a hip, that's probably a $75,000 hospital visit, maybe ICU, maybe surgery on the hip. If somebody in the healthcare system says to your grandmother, you're doing great, I'm going to come and put a bar in your shower and I'm going to move your bedroom to the first floor, and prevents that fall, that's like $125, right? And nobody's going to do it because the system is geared towards making the $75,000. So as soon as you can create a system that puts in bars to keep people from falling, then you'll start to see radical changes in the cost curve.
Well, we are excited to start taking questions from the audience here. If you have thoughts or curiosities about how we reform entitlements, put our budget on a sustainable path while still making sure these important programs are there to serve their original purpose, please comment below. Charlie, it seems to me that when bipartisan proposals come before the Congress, Simpson-Bowles in one way, shape, or form got a vote in the House, and there have been proposals in the Senate as well, that folks are maybe scared to take tough votes because they know they're going to be bludgeoned by the other side and cherry picking parts of these balanced plans. For example, if Simpson-Bowles saved some money out of the Medicare budget because of some of the things that we were talking about, the other party would run attack ads in the election against the people who voted for it, saying that you cut benefits for people on the program. So it seems like without some mutual trust between both sides, it's going to be hard to get to a solution. How can independents be a part of making that happen?
I think the independents can be the brokers of that deal. They can convene that discussion. One of the things I said in my post to kind of set up this discussion is that both political parties at present tend to make promises in the primaries that are entirely inconsistent with everything we've discussed so far. On the Republican side, it tends to be a blanket promise not to increase revenue. You even have Grover Norquist with his pledge, I will not increase revenues in any way. And that includes, by the way, closing loopholes. It really puts a straitjacket on anybody who wants to win a Republican primary. And then they've won and they've promised what we know has to be one ingredient to this compromise solution. On the Democratic side, they've promised not to touch entitlements and in some cases to expand them, which is totally inconsistent. If you've got a program you can't afford now, don't make it bigger. That means that typically the two parties arrive in DC already having promised that they won't do what is essential to make this work. Independents would be elected without making those hobbling promises, and hopefully they can create the trust that will allow the politicians to kind of come out of their comfort zone to a point where they're capable of making these hard decisions.
Totally. So we know that there's a real cost for waiting. One analysis showed that if we wait 10 years to even deal with this problem, the amount of cuts or the amount of taxes would have to be 50% greater than they are today. So we're essentially shoving a greater problem off. It's not going to be the same one that we encounter 10 years from now. The other thing that we maybe want to talk more about is just on interest. And I think we put out a good graphic on this today on our Facebook page, which we can bring up, which shows that interest is on its way to becoming the largest line item in the federal budget. It's the fastest growing. Why is that a problem?
Well, what do you get when you pay interest? This is going to our bondholders. So it's going to China, it's going to Japan, it's going to Saudi Arabia, it's going to some investors. But for that, we get nothing. That is just like credit card interest. You don't get research, you don't get weapons, you don't get schools, you don't get highways. It is a pocket of money, soon to be bigger than the entire defense budget, that gets us nothing. And in general, I'm no great public finance whiz. In general, you do not want to be spending a lot of money and getting nothing.
Right. That's where we're headed. Maybe
that's where we're headed, right? I just as a little aside here, the moment when I lost faith that the two parties were going to deal with this was when the Simpson-Bowles Commission failed to get a vote in Congress. And you alluded to it earlier, this was a process I thought was quite clever to make it a little easier for Congress to make the tough votes. They created a commission that was made up of members of Congress who would do the hard choices, but then they would bring it back to Congress for an up or down vote. And I believe they needed maybe a supermajority of that commission to force the up or down vote. In the end, and they came back with a bunch of solutions that we've already talked about. They raised the retirement age. They made some other modifications to entitlements. They didn't do as much on healthcare as they probably should have. They closed a lot of loopholes and raised revenue. They capped just federal spending as a proportion of GDP, all sensible things, raised the gas tax. But after they came back with their findings, the two people who could have moved this over the finish line, President Barack Obama and Paul Ryan, who was then the go-to guy on fiscal issues in the Republican Party, both voted, well, Ryan voted against the recommendations and Obama just never got behind them. But the net effect of the two leaders of the two-party leaving this to lie kind of like a dead fish meant that nobody was going to make that hard vote. And that was when I realized, okay, the important people are beholden to their parties, not to fixing this fiscal problem.
Totally. I may have even reached that conclusion a little bit before you, because the commission was set up because Congress failed to establish one. And when both parties, Republicans were saying, we need a commission to deal with the debt. They didn't expect it to pass. And as it became clear that it was going to pass, well, that means President Obama might have gotten credit for creating the commission that could have solved the problem. And so 6 Republican senators at the last minute pulled off the bill and spiked it. So Congress couldn't create the commission, and so the president wound up doing it. they couldn't even agree to discuss the issue, no less come together on any kind of solution. So you're right. I mean, I've always said that, our country is going broke because the political system is broken. If we want to fix the budget, we have to fix our politics.
Yeah. And we can substantively, I know we can come to agreement. One of the most enjoyable things I do every year, Senator Judd Gregg, who was on that commission, I believe the original idea was his, along with Senator Kent Conrad. He was an architect of this, very concerned about the debt. He comes to my class every summer, and we call up one of those budget exercises. I can't remember if we do fix the debt. And he's more conservative than I am, but we go line by line, and the students are watching as we kind of debate all the choices, and we have to fix, we basically have to get the debt to 60% of GDP by the end of class. And what's interesting is in some areas, he's more willing to cut than I am, because he knows which weapon systems are a complete waste of money. I'll say, I don't know enough about this. He's like, get rid of it. It's a complete waste of money. We agree on raising the retirement age with Social Security. I can never get him to embrace a carbon tax, but he does compromise with an increase in the gas tax. And, we've got usually 20 minutes left of extra time at the end of class, and we've done it. And that's with a fair bit of ideological disagreement.
Right. In our final few minutes, let's rapid fire a couple of questions we got. Virginia asked, how do we get doctors to buy into such a radical change in healthcare delivery that you were talking about before?
It's a great question. I'm actually on a hospital board as well. And when I joined the board, it was when I realized that things were as bad as I thought they were. Doctors, hospitals, people in the system know that it's broken. They also know that they can't fix it alone, because if you move to a value-based system when all the incentives are for filling beds and doing tests, you will literally go broke. So I think doctors are willing to be led there. You just slowly have to change the incentives. Medicare has actually made a decent amount of progress where they have started to pay fixed amount for certain diseases and so on. That's a step in the right direction. The creation of affordable care organizations, ACOs, which the Affordable Care Act kind of set in motion, is also a great step, where an organization will be responsible for a large group of patients and you get a fixed payment regardless of how you treat them. There are certain quality benchmarks, and if you hit those benchmarks, you get to share any cost savings with whoever's paying the bill. That's a huge step in the right direction. So there are plenty of ideas out there. It just takes the leadership to kind of move us in a direction that's consistent with implementing them.
And speaking of a way to how to get some of these ideas moving forward, David asks about the Problem Solvers Caucus currently in the House, 24 Democrats, 24 Republicans, something that our friendly organization, No Labels, has been working on. What is your assessment in the way that they can play a role in this?
I think it's a really important development. I think No Labels in general is really important because they're trying to get these groups to collaborate. I've been disappointed in the effect that the Problem Solvers Caucus can then have on their parties. So it's great that they're joining, but I've yet to see any manifestation of that in terms of legislation that really moves the dial on the debt, for example, on fixing the Affordable Care Act, on infrastructure. There are too many places where logical action hasn't happened. You pretty much go back through all our previous common grounds. And the Problem Solvers Caucus, while a step in that right direction, clearly hasn't been enough. And I would say any independents who get elected would immediately join that. And I assume they would support independence. So it's consistent with what we're doing. I just think we need to do more of it.
Right. It was encouraging what I saw, David, that they put forward as far as a potential healthcare fix when sort of that discussion broke down between both parties. The caucus was able to at least put forward some ideas on that issue. Before we close out, Charlie, any final thoughts on this issue, this edition?
I will say what I said in the preface to my piece, which is the thing about financial crises is you never get a memo saying that they're going to happen 3 months from Tuesday at 4 o'clock. Everything's always fine. And many people will say, look, there couldn't be a problem with the debt because the world is still rushing to buy our treasury bonds. So what's the deal? I would add a couple things. First of all, the interest rate just climbed above, long-term interest rate just climbed above 3% for the first time. So interest rates are climbing in part because the economy is coming back. The Fed is raising interest rates. But you never quite know. I would suspect there's also a bit of a risk premium being built into that, or an inflation premium, which is another way you can make your debt go away really fast, just inflate it away. I would also add that in the past, there was no problem. People said real estate's fine. That was 2006. Even as economists said, you know what, this trend doesn't seem like it can go on forever. The Greek debt crisis, people didn't think in 2005 that the Greek government was a bastion of fiscal responsibility. They just thought, wow, it hasn't caused a problem yet. So anytime you find something that doesn't look quite right and hasn't caused a problem yet, doesn't mean it's not going to cause a problem next Tuesday. So I do think we've reached alarming territory on this issue. The numbers just can't keep going the way they are. And I quoted Herb Stein, who said famously, things that can't go on forever will stop. The question is how, when, and at what cost.
Right. And there's good reason to be concerned the problem's even worse than what we think. We talk about the debt going up by $13 trillion over the next decade, but that doesn't count all the unfunded liabilities into the future, which exceed over $200 trillion by some estimates. So Congress isn't being honest in the way they're doing their accounting. So this is a big problem to solve, and it's going to take some new leadership to do it, which is why we're doing what we're doing with Unite America and invite you to join us. So if you've watched this video today, if you want to help find and elect leaders who are going to tackle problems and find common ground, join as a member. You get to contribute whatever you can every month. And together with thousands across the country, that's going to make sure that the only special interest in politics becomes the people themselves. And so your small contributions make that possible. It's uniteamerica.org/membership. And we'll send you a great copy of the Centrist Manifesto, Charlie's book, in which some of these great ideas are laid out.
And we have bumper stickers now. I'll say one of the most heartening things that happened to me is I was wearing my Unite America hat, and someone in the supermarket said, hey, tell me about that. That's what we need to do. Mort Kondrak, he put the bumper sticker on his car. He said people are already commenting on it. It clearly strikes a chord.
Definitely. So the site store is up. Shop away. And Charlie and I will see you here again next month for another edition of Finding Common Ground. Thanks for tuning in.